very much, Sirpa, for that introduction, and also to Roland-Jan for the invitation to join you this morning. Um, it's a great opportunity, so I'm grateful for it. I noticed that looking back at this series of talks, the European Commission, you've already had these wake-up calls from really top environmental experts in like Johan Rockström, Sandrine Dixon, Tina Palmer, Maya Gopal, Petteri Talas. They've all been warning about the risks of irreversible climate change. So I'm not going to go over that science. Instead, I want to share a few ideas about what if they're right about the problem, but their wish is that all societies around the world change fast enough to good enough effect, turn out to be unfulfilled? What if those wishes turn out to be unfulfilled? What if it's too late to prevent dangerous levels of climate change, further affecting food, water, trade, infectious disease, and in turn, our economic systems, our political cultures, our physical and mental health? It's not an easy topic, especially for those of us who've given our professional lives to seeking to reform our current systems and culture to transition to a greener way of life. So I was thankful for that introduction, Sirpa, that absolutely I've been engaged in corporate sustainability for my whole career since 1995. So yeah, it's I think it really is time now to keep pushing for the best, but also to prepare for the worst. And because I want to start with sharing, I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, and I want to start with just reflecting on something that puts this in a very present context, because it affects all of us. It's a stressful situation, and it's the implications of pandemic disease and what we can learn from that. So last century, we never had a coronavirus outbreak that would kill people. All we got were runny noses, the common cold. But in the last 16 years, we've had 3 outbreaks of coronaviruses that can kill: SARS, MERS, and COVID. So some epidemiologists have predicted or have analyzed this is due in part to environmental damage and climate change. And last year, the UNEP, July 2020, confirmed that analysis. So because of that, some epidemiologists have sought more funds for experiments on viruses because they're concerned about this new era of pandemic risk. Of course, that comes with its own risks, despite all efforts at biosafety. Lab leaks are simply normal. So a US government report in 2007 documented there were 2 lab leaks every week from biosafety level 3 and 4 labs. So I don't know if there's similar research or data about the situation in Europe. I know there are dozens of labs. But for me, the important point here is that by damaging nature and then seeking to protect ourselves from that damage, we are making pandemic disease more likely. And we're already seeing the ramifications of that: economics, politics, civic freedoms, education, physical and mental health. So whatever happens to COVID-19 in the future, the bigger picture we should recognize is we're in for more and more disease and more disruption from that. So I think it means we need a dialogue about smarter, more long-term, more holistic and socially just responses to this horrible new era of pandemic risk. And of course, redoubling our efforts to conserve nature so that we're not contributing to the origin of the problem. Now, I'm focusing on disease for my opening remarks, not because it's my specialism, it's not, but because when we're talking about environmental impacts, it's clearly a thing that people in the environmental sector don't really know how to approach. It's contentious, it's complex, it's uncertain. People get kind of upset about it. So it's almost like for environmentalists, it's become the elephant in the Zoom, stuff that we really should be talking about, but we don't. So for me, I think the benefit of normalizing in anticipation of societal disruption and even collapse is that we can approach the full implications of things like zoonotic disease much more deliberately, just like we will then should be approaching matters of food security more deliberately, which means not downplaying it, not laughing it off as doomism, or not allowing our own discomfort with this topic to become attempts to shun it or shut it down. Now, unfortunately, some people have been trying to shut down this conversation around collapse anticipation. And it's why 600 scholars in 30 countries signed an international scholars warning about 6 months ago on this very topic of societal disruption and collapse. I was one of them, and we were saying that we need more sober and serious dialogue about this matter. But unfortunately, the world's media and many of the elites haven't wanted to hear that kind of message. So I think before sharing thoughts on the implications, how to be more deliberate about this, and taking your questions on it, I think it might be useful to share some thoughts on some of those criticisms that we're hearing. So if you didn't know, collapse anticipation, whether it's collapsology or deep adaptation, has become much more well known. And so some professionals in the environmental field are arguing that it's scientifically wrong or it's counterproductive to efforts on sustainability. So when I've been talking to them, I've been asking them to recognize there's a normality bias, where we think that what's normal in our everyday experience right now is going to continue. Of course, that's been shaken a bit by the pandemic, but still it's a key way that we think it's a key bias. And it shows up in the discussion of the latest climate science in a way that apportions the burden of proof quite arbitrarily. So if you anticipate that everything will change everywhere in the world almost immediately, and we'll get lucky that that change is sufficient, despite an already existing destabilization of global environmental systems, then the mainstream scientific establishment does not demand that you prove the basis for your anticipation of all that changing. But when I anticipate societal disruption and collapse, all I'm doing is anticipating that what's happening now on many levels will continue to occur in similar ways. For example, anthropogenic carbon emissions. They've continued near exponentially since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, with a couple of blips in 2008 and 2020. Although now in 2021, they've let back up at one of the highest rates ever. So that's despite decades of awareness, of campaigning, of policy initiative, and technological advance. So why should we need to prove that this won't continue before assessing the implications of it continuing? Or if we look at atmospheric carbon concentrations, ppm, they've also increased almost exponentially since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, no matter what we've been doing. And they increased in 2020 despite a 7% drop in anthropogenic carbon emissions. That in itself suggests that some of the self-reinforcing feedbacks may have already started, such as, for example, the Amazon, which latest science shows is moving from sink of carbon to source of carbon as the soils dry and as it catches fire. So again, why should it need to be proven that this won't continue before assessing the implications of it continuing? And then we could look at other indicators of impacts on the environment, sea level rise, loss of Arctic ice, loss of land ice, increase in droughts and floods, loss of biodiversity, release of methane from on-land permafrost, similar trends. Again, why should it be proven that this won't continue before assessing the implications of it continuing? And same for impacts on society, storm damage to property, erratic weather damage to crops, impacts of zoonotic disease on societies in general. All these trends are really bad in the wrong direction. Why should it need to be proven that this won't continue, rather than to assess the implications of it continuing now with an open mind, creativity, in dialogue, support each other to work out what to do in our professional and personal lives? Now, I think it's good news that we're seeing a new emphasis on adaptation to climate change from, say, the World Bank, European Commission, various intergovernmental organizations. But research, the latest research on that mainstream climate adaptation field, finds it's too limited and it can even be counterproductive. For example, one IPCC lead author, Dr. Lisa Schipper from Oxford University, has done quite a bit of research to show that the adaptation that's occurring is effectively trying to patch up situations which can't continue and which are also adding to inequality. So rather than having a shallow view of adaptation, my assess is that the trends I've just described earlier are going to disrupt our food systems, economic systems, financial systems, and even our belief systems sufficiently to fracture industrial consumer society. That's definitely going a lot further than the mainstream debate on climate adaptation, and it's why I call it deep adaptation. Now, of course, our societies are highly complex, so it's a fool's game to try and say which particular impact will break the cultural camel's back. So in my work in deep adaptation and the work in the emerging collapsology field, most of us aren't spending time to try and analyze and predict when collapse or how collapse will happen, or how confident we can be, according to a particular frame of reference of a particular epistemology. Instead, we're just taking it as extremely plausible, and therefore must now be worked on, and worked on way more than is currently happening. Ultimately, the cultural impacts of people waking up to this situation and experiencing the psychosocial stress about it could easily cause more problems. But it doesn't have to be that way if more of us are prepared to face the situation and support each other in what is a very difficult topic, and support each other to be curious and compassionate, explore in dialogue what the implications are. And there's lots of evidence against the argument that to anticipate collapse breeds apathy. You can just talk to climate activists and pay attention to the life stories of the leaders of it. And they say quite clearly that they continue to push for the best in terms of mitigation policies, but also to now prepare for the worst. There's also research on psychological impacts of collapse anticipation, which do not say that people give up. And I think the problem has been that a lot of people working on environmental psychology have drawn upon behavioral psychology and behavioral economics. So they focused on consumer behavior, where people want to know that if I buy one thing, not another thing, there'll be some impact. So that's not understanding our fullness as human beings. We are citizens. We are agents of change. We can all be co-leaders in our communities and our organizations. So yeah, to assume anticipation of collapse or disruption would be disabling of radical action could be telling us more about us who might assume that than other people. And I say that because that was my story before. I thought that to think that we can't reform this way of life and transition to a greener way of life, that we were in for a lot of terrible change, disruptive change, and associated pain and suffering. That was too dark for me. I thought I would get stuck in despair. I thought I might give up. I wouldn't know what to do with my life. But fortunately, I found a place beyond that, thanks to people who were prepared to look at this difficult stuff with me and be loving about it. Not to say, Jem, pull yourself together, stop being pessimistic, whatever, but we could hold each other in that despair and end up becoming much more creative and committed to finding out what's right to do and doing that no matter what. And I think the key is that we need that at a much larger scale, like a social dialogue about this situation, because currently these topics are being discussed behind closed doors and sometimes within organizations with narrow mandates. So, for example, the military of defense in the UK have been talking about this in their strategic planning. You know, what does it mean for the capabilities of the British military if societies are collapsing because of climate change? And they're coming up with some not very good ideas, like having to fight wars to sustain the capability of fighting wars. So you can see where that kind of thinking will lead. So I think it's imperative for more people across all aspects of society to find ways, thinking and talking about these complicated, interconnected threats, what they might mean, in ways that are not going to be determined by our fear or our haste or an easy submission to authoritarian stories of where safety might be. Because we need more wisdom than we've ever had. And that means not just more rationality, which would be great, but also a kind of meta-rationality, because we become less wise the more we're going to just be fear-driven or reactive. We've got to have space for imagination, not just Gantt charts and risk analyses and so forth. We need to bring our whole selves to this problem. So for that, I've offered a framework in my book, my new book released this month. It's called Deep Adaptation. And that term has become a bit of an umbrella term, I think, for an ethos, a framework, a community, and a movement. The ethos is essentially a commitment to working together to do what's helpful during this disruption and ultimate collapse of societies. It's an ethos of being engaged, open-hearted, open-minded about how to be and how to respond. So it's kind of an ethos that's the opposite of Mad Max, the opposite of prepper mentality. It's looking at this and saying, how can I show up in love and creativity and do the right thing? But it's also a framework for exploring ideas about how to do that. And that's called the 4 R's of deep adaptation, which is resilience, relinquishment, restoration, and reconciliation. It's basically asking, what do we most value that we want to keep? What is it that we should probably let go of or will make matters worse? What can we bring back from the ways of living we used to have that could help? And what is it we simply have to make peace with? Perhaps, for example, this assumption that we have progress, that we can be in control. Maybe that's what we have to make peace with. These are deliberately questions because there aren't simple answers. I really think we need to hold people in each other in generative dialogue. It's also a community that believe in that. There's thousands of participants and hundreds of volunteers now in the International Deep Adaptation Forum and various national groups and daily events online. At the moment, that community is quite focused on the emotional support and ways of helping each other explore what to do. And helping skills for organizing. So that's quite community focused, but there's much more as planned, and quite a lot of people who've learned a lot of skills in the couple of years that's been around now want to bring that into organizations. I'd say it's also a bit of a movement now because I keep hearing of new stories of people from around the world who are using the deep adaptation framing. So for example, in southern India, I learned that there was a group there that were meeting regularly about deep adaptation and focusing on things like water security, food security, not just for them, but their local bioregion. And then when COVID hit, they mobilized and within a week were providing emergency support to all the migrant workers who suddenly had no work and no ability to get home. So I think we see there that, again, if you're anticipating disruption, if it's not just like the humanitarian agencies or disaster relief agencies and those people in government who have responsibility for that, but if generally more people in society are anticipating that, just in the same way in Australia, people are prepared for bushfires more than ever before. The more people prepare, the more people can immediately come together to help each other and not make matters worse. So I think it's only a matter of time before more people discuss the question, what if the way of life in Europe that we're used to is going to change because of environmental damage? What is it that we want to retain, let go of, restore, or reconcile with? And the DA community, deep adaptation community, has been around for a couple of years. It does have approaches that could help others engage in this matter in a generative way. And it could simply start with convening a discussion group amongst your own colleagues and families together about, well, what is ours to do if our way of life will continue to be disrupted? And that could be an unofficial or official dialogue. It could use the deep adaptation frameworks or not. But I think it's important to get started because so many of the senior leaders I know from my previous career in the UN or working with the World Economic Forum as a young global leader, also in business and finance, also in the NGO movement, so many senior leaders across all of that. Also, I did work in politics in the UK, in that field too. They're wondering about this topic, but they're not yet finding ways to engage in it because it's tough. And none of us, understandably, want to bring painful news to people. So everything has to be very carefully done, and we need to hold each other and have good methodologies for how we explore this together. So thanks for listening. I'm looking forward to hearing what kind of questions would come from within the Commission on this topic.
Thank you, Jem, for your intervention. And now, as usual, the space is free for your questions and comments. And you can either put them on the chat, and Roland will help me to pick them from there in the case that I wouldn't notice them. or you can raise your hand, or then when there's the silent moment, you can grab just the mic and pose your question. And while we are waiting the questions, I'll start with my first one. And this is sort of a twofold. Actually, you referred already, for example, the military and defense sectors preparedness work, what has done in UK, and you are probably very well aware about the similar activities in both in Australia and NATO, for example. And my question is, we heard some of that, those ones a bit early on. What is your sort of analysis, even though you said you do not agree about the sort of outcomes, how to solve the crisis? What is your take on those? How sort of a valid analysis of the situation they are? Do you agree, disagree? Then the second question would be that yes, you gave us the advice to work as human beings and be part of the movement and discuss with ourselves and colleagues. But then if you sort of look us as politicians and business leaders, what would be your advice how to put this discussion on the table in policy level? Because certainly we could be doing more effective things in policies also if we would sort of take this uh, um, I wouldn't put it catastrophizing or deep adaptation. I would call it resilience, about a bit lessons learned from the COVID. Things might happen, and then you would need to see how the societal systems would need to be sustained and survived. So
Thank
please,
you.
if you comment on these ones, and then we'll pick up. We have two questions on the
Mhm.
chat.
So if I'll just repeat what I think I heard as your questions. I'll answer those, and then you can tell me whether I understood your questions. The first one is, what is my view of the way the militaries that I know of are assessing the security implications of some of the worst case scenarios of climate change coming true? Um, so I think it's kind of obvious and normal that having a narrow notion of security would lead to them coming up with, for example, we might have to go to war to maintain the resources for the capability to continue to go to war. Obviously, if you step back from that and you imagine countries around the world thinking like that, and therefore putting more and more investment into the capabilities for war because they think it's inevitable because of climate change, that's a terrible situation. So I don't blame military strategists for arriving at that idea. I think what it means is we urgently need other government departments, other parts of society, civil society, religions, all sorts, talking about, oh, what does it mean if we're now in an era of greater disruption, which is going to disrupt food supplies, disrupt trade routes, all sorts, maybe bankrupt the insurance industry, cause all kinds of problems, including future pandemic. The work I've done is to say, can we not start talking about this rather than effectively being proud cowards, which is what I see happening so much, which is coming up with ways of just dismissing this. And I think that's irresponsible. So I'm just encouraging people to find ways of talking about it. So that's coming on to your next question, which is, what should politicians and business leaders do? So there's a number of things, and again, it's in the area of how do you normalize a conversation about this rather than it just being seen as catastrophic thinking. And there are existing fields like business continuity management, catastrophic risk management, disaster risk management, that can all be engaged with and expanded from. Yes, a framing such as resilience may feel very much more approachable for people, so long as it includes an understanding that success does not necessarily mean keeping everything as we've experienced it until now. I think there will have to be a lot of ways of life that that are let go of, a lot of assumptions that are let go of. That's also being realistic about mitigation. I mean, there was a debate in the UK about what are we going to do if the UK moves off gas for heating and cooking. No one in the public in Britain, or in the media discussion, was saying, well, actually, do you not remember when we only used to have one warm room in a house, and you'd have to have a hot water bottle before you go up the stairs, and has no one lived in a drafty house where you have jumpers, coats, and hats on in winter indoors? I'm not that old. That's in my memory. So people don't want to seem to talk about lifestyle change, even with mitigation, let alone with adaptation to just impacts on our way of life. So yes, you have to be careful about the language you choose, the framing you choose. You could seek to engage existing places where the conversation has been had, but we need to see more on this, because otherwise all manner of silly ideas could be developed behind closed doors because of the logics of the institutions that are looking at this. I see lots of questions in the chat. Who do I pick them, or do you see it, but do you pick them, or who? What happens? I can't hear you, Sirpa, sorry. Shall I just?
Sorry. I see as well that there are a lot of questions. It might be more lenient if you just pick up the questions there and answer them instead of me just sort of picking them. Please go ahead, Jim.
Okay. So I'll start with Roland-Jan. You've put a question. If more people become convinced that societal collapse will be inevitable, won't this provide an easy way out for some governments of not doing their utmost to prevent climate change? It's a good question, because there has been some expedient and disingenuous use of the notion of adaptation in Australia by the current government. So Australia has had a terrible time with bushfires, with droughts, storm damage, floods, and so on, with coral reef being so badly damaged as well. And so moving from climate denial, the government then went to, oh, well, it's too late. So absolutely, there's a problem there. But that doesn't mean that because some people are idiots in the way they interpret this and just telling nonsense in order to just keep their own show on the road, doesn't mean that we don't look at it. So we have to anticipate that possibility and then organize ourselves to have a different narrative, a different response, and promote it. The thing is, if we don't begin to adapt and societies become authoritarian hellholes, then where's going to be the support for continuing to work multilaterally on bold mitigation measures and drawdown measures? You know, if society is becoming a total mess nationally and multilaterally, then so for me, the efforts on mitigation and adaptation are complementary. And yes, I do think at a time where if things get really bad, then countries that still have a bit of coal will dig it up. But again, that doesn't mean that we don't try and help people learn about how we got into this mess. I mean, for me, that's the one silver lining of this horrible predicament, is that we can use it as an opportunity to learn and unlearn. But that means we have to be prepared to really look at ourselves. I'm going to go up to top. Louise, as a young activist and student, I feel anger of having to work with and tackle this crisis when the effects of our lifestyle have been known for decades already. Yes, And so you should. It's natural to feel anger, and it's natural for that anger not to be unspecific, but also to be channeled with some sense of who to blame. I would say that what I've noticed is some people want to frame this as an intergenerational anger, because it helps them maintain power. So the World Economic Forum invited a lot of young climate activists to the World Economic Forum, and they were promoting the idea that the older generations have let down the younger generations. That is rubbish. We've had centuries of people fighting corporate power, fighting the abuse of power by all sorts of organizations to protect their environments. And that's, not just indigenous peoples, but all sorts. And it's been a certain way of behaving economically and politically that is at fault. So if we frame this as an intergenerational thing, then we're not looking at what the struggles have been and why they failed, and we're not really looking how to learn about that. We're just setting it up for authoritarian governments in future to get young people to say, yeah, let old people die. So we've got to look at power, keep our eye on how elite power looks to try and frame what we do about our anger, our righteous anger, our grief, our sadness, our fear, how we respond, in which we'll just try and protect their own power. And that's another question from Louise. I'll come back to that. I'll look for other ones. Push for the best, prepare for the worst, a common and urgent task for education. Are our schools and universities learning the sad facts and the hopeful recipes for the just transition? No. Our schools, I guess you mean European and including British schools and universities. No, the whole paradigm of education is based on an industrial mindset, I'd say patriarchal mindset. Neoliberalism has infected the whole process. People are not, the primary important thing about education is to help people understand themselves and others and relate better. Just the emphasis on testing and all sorts, it's making people think that there's a right answer to everything and they should shut up until they know the answer. That's exact opposite of what we need to help people be ingenious and creative and adaptable to whatever's going to happen in society. The problem many schools face is the kind of things that would be good to teach kids now are the things that teachers don't know. So we might have to get retired people out of retirement back into schools and teach things like food preparation, storage, horticultural gardening, DIY, all sorts of things. Even at this level, get people to learn how they can play games together rather than just be sitting in front of a device or TV. Improv theatre, all sorts. This should, we need to find ways of enjoying life and processing difficult emotions, including the biochemistry of the difficult emotions, in ways that don't require us to just be on screens all the time using energy, because the amount of disruption that's coming could very well, for many people, mean that they won't have access to this kind of functionality that we've got now. So I would say a total paradigm shift in education would be helpful. And I'm not saying that that's going to happen. I don't think it will. And so I don't think there will be a just transition. But that doesn't mean that we don't still try and do it. That's the thing. There's this progressivist modernist assumption that you need to know what your goal is, and you need to have some kind of nirvana or utopia here that you transition to, and then because of that, then you work towards it. Well, that's, in the history of human thought, an extremely juvenile idea. That all ancient wisdom traditions are about just how are we to be in the presence of suffering and loss and tragedy. And the idea, the modernist idea that we do things because we know it's going to deliver some future goal, it's a very young concept in the history of human thought. And it's not helpful. It won't be sustainable because things will just continually get worse. So lots of things here. So, all right, I'm just going to read one out that I haven't read already. Aaron, in 1989, what has been said to be impossible happened. Berlin Wall came down. I think we can make it again. We can make the impossible happen and achieve fast and transformative change. And with this deep adaptation, will not become necessary. Okay. Oh, and with this, then deep adaptation. So the history, you're talking about revolutionary change. So ultimately, you're talking about people being prepared to die or be imprisoned for what they believe in. So analysis of that is that that happens when people get to the point that they will do something, no matter if that means that they will have a horrible time or die or lose one of their loved ones. We have decades of proof that bright green environmentalism never delivers that sense of commitment to revolutionary change. We have evidence from Extinction Rebellion that the opposite of stories of hope delivers that kind of commitment. The former head of finance of Extinction Rebellion, Andrew Medhurst, read my paper in 2018, realized, it's almost certainly too late to stop a catastrophe, so he's going to spend the rest of his life doing what matters. He quit his job and joined XR. Skeena Rathore, one of the co-founders of XR, read my paper, quit her job, went full-time in XR. We need revolutionaries on the environment. So we need loving, compassionate, imaginative, non-dogmatic revolutionaries. And we don't. We've had an environmental discourse which tells you, oh, be a bit better, recycle more, travel less, learn more. Think that if more people are a bit more like you, then we'll fix things. You know, it's a very narcissistic discourse in mainstream environmentalism, rather than giving one's life to a cause. So if transformative change does happen, no, the climate's going to get better. Sorry, the climate is going to get worse for human habitation for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So we don't end up at an ecological civilization which is not more disrupted by weather and zoonotic disease. No matter what happens, we have entered an era of pandemics already. You know, 3 already in 16 years. Coronavirus, there was no coronavirus killing people in the previous century. There's no getting out of this. We've already started massive damage in the environment, and we are the environment. The environment is us, so we are damaging ourselves and our future selves. So I think stories of ecological civilization are just ways of trying to escape your pain. And I believe those stories. But that's also, but be with the pain. Grief is with us for the rest of our lives. It doesn't mean that we don't try and do good stuff. And in fact, we've got a lot of evidence that it's precisely because of that existential shock that people transform their lives and throw away all these stories of incremental change and, oh, if only more people, you know, knew about how bad things were, then blah, blah, blah. You know, all the stories I've been working in environmental stuff since 1995. I've heard all these stories before. It's basically because people want to have their cake and eat it. They want to keep their job. They want to keep their career. They want to keep their sense of progress and so on. And I completely understand that. Really understand that. That's been my career until the last 3 years. I am survivalists. Okay, So Karen, on the survivalist issue, the problem is people talk about what the impact will be on other people without realizing the field of psychology you can go to, and there's lots of research on this topic. So for example, if someone knows they're going to die, or knows their child's going to die, or knows that there's a catastrophe coming that's going to destroy their village, there's a lot of research on it. There's a lot of research in terror management theory, and then how do you help people move beyond a defensive prepper response into a more amazing place. There's a lot of work in spiritual traditions about so-called via negativa and the positive disintegration of self that can come from despair in ways that are transformative. So what we see is a lot of commentators on environment talking nonsense about psychology by using tropes from modernity, like, oh, don't be negative, or that's not going to help. Well, I'm sorry, if you are a scholar in environment, then you shouldn't be talking about psychology without looking at it first. So I've published a review with a psychologist. We did a literature review on the field of psychology and what it says about the anticipation of disruption and collapse, the anticipation of personal vulnerability. What does that do for people, and why, and in what contexts? So that's on my blog. It's called "Should We Talk About Collapse?" Should we talk about our anticipation of collapse? And you may have noticed in my voice, I get annoyed with it. You know, you have climatologists talking as if they know something about psychology without even realizing there's a field of psychology. And all they're basically saying is how they feel. They're just projecting their inner world onto other people. Is there any hope of solving our problems as long as Elon Musk is considered a genius and a hero? I work in critical leadership studies. There's no such thing as leadership other than the word of it, and then there's all kinds of good things like being good at communicating, being good at understanding other people and what support they need, being able to be clear on your analysis on a situation, and there's all different sort of functions. But the notion of leadership, I think, confuses people. There's a lot of research to show that people, if things go badly or things go well, people blame the leader without any evidence. It's just an easy way of It's an easy way of not understanding social change or organizational change. So yes, the overemphasis on the great man story of change isn't helpful. There's no one coming to save us, and therefore it's up to us to do what we can in our own lives, professionally and personally. So I'd like to say, if you're in, this is a massive field, and normally when I talk about this, I only agree if there's a facilitated process afterwards to hold people with their emotions. So any emotions you've got, shock, fear, anger, all sorts, and some of you might have a sense of relief. That's all. That happens to lots of people about this, and we can explore all that, why it's happening, and what is helpful information, and what's maybe just holding us back from going deeper into this. We haven't got that situation now, but if you're interested, the Deep Adaptation Forum has a lot of processes for regularly to hold people in that space of deep listening, deep relating, generative dialogue. So that's deepadaptation.info, I-N-F-O. There's a lot of writing on my blog, bendell.com. If you're interested in the scholars who are saying similar things to me, scholarswarning.net. There's a question here about my own adaptation. So it started with inner work. I began to realize I had a story of my self-acceptance, self-worth being about my contribution to positive social change. And I was traumatized by what I was thinking I was now concluding. So it started with a lot of personal work. So yeah, I did a lot of things like improv theater, breath work, meditation, studied Buddhism, a lot of all of that. And I just made some big decisions in my life. So I went down to, well, I took a year off university, unpaid. And then when I returned, I went down just 2 days a week. So I could clear space in my life for exploring what to do. I explored whether I could live off grid in a sort of a sustainable way, and I realized I was pretending to myself that that would somehow work. And I realized, in terms of you know, if people are living in villages anywhere in Europe growing their own onions and everyone's starving in the city, then that's not a resilient way of life. So it's a nonsense, really. If we want to work at resilience, we have to work collectively. And so I thought, right, I will give my, yeah, well, a big thing was I stopped worrying about pension. I stopped worrying about assets long term. I gave a lot of money away to create the Deep Adaptation Forum. I worked for free for 2 years to create that. I was motivated by the idea of trying to enable loving responses to this situation. And then when that thing took off, then it became attacked, misrepresented. So I spent quite a lot of time defending it. And then, so yeah, it was trying to create community of people who were prepared to relate differently around this, thinking that that might help send out ripples and create change, which might help reduce harm in future. So it was a decision that I'm not going to work on my own security or safety. I don't have children, and so it was easier for me to do what I've done. And then I decided I was going to move country, live somewhere cheap, and live in a place where I think it's not going to be affected by a multi-breadbasket failure, which I predict to happen with wheat or barley or maize in the next few years, where I don't need imports of lots of oil and gas, where I'm surrounded by a culture that is overtly spiritual, different to mine, but invites me to really connect back with nature and existential stuff. I've just taken a lease on a house for 10 years rather than buying one, and I've gone for quite a cheap place again, so I don't have to worry about earning money. And I'm going to start now working with, I've started working with a Buddhist temple to help keep them going, and I've now going to start working on in local agricultural production. So I'm in Indonesia. So I made that decision. But the first thing was the Deep Adaptation Forum stuff. I think I have spent too much time working hard rather than loving life and being there for people. You know, when people get a terminal diagnosis, they sort of rediscover what's important. And I had a phase of that with some of this, but I think then I've just gone back to being super busy.
Well, thank you. I'm just checking about the latest in the chat.
Mm-hmm. You want me to say more, or do you want to?
Well, there's mainly there's one question we still have time for, that from Bettina Mogenson from Move. So if you pick up of that, and then there's thank yous, and you put already the linkage, links what you mentioned on the chat. So please, everybody, go there and check them if you are interested to follow them. But Jem, this last question, and then we start wrapping up.
Sure. Also on my website, there's a link at the top right about emotional psychological support that's available. And also from the deepadaptation.info website, you can click through to a database of coaches. So these are all people who've, in their own lives, they've got to a point where they anticipate disruption and even collapse. And they're business coaches, life coaches, therapists. So they meet people at that place, because a lot of people just think you're being a bit pessimistic and say you can't be supported in that. But through Deep Adaptation Info, you can find that. Bettina, while the Commission is aware and the petition staff got over 11,000 signatures, Fridays for the Future, much. A lot is said and a lot of money will be mobilized to build back better. Even with this effort, it looks like a long process and not everyone at the same pace. Moreover, the geopolitical and economic battles are going on there. Multilateralism seems to be put aside by leaders. So if we join your movement, what do you anticipate we can achieve exactly and by when? Okay. Bettina, well, I don't know. I'd say it's not my movement. I left the Deep Adaptation Forum in September. It's run by volunteers. They've now created a new system of self-organizing circles. So people who basically, it's on an ethos of, I want to enable loving responses to collapse. And so for each of us, that's different. You know, someone will be like, okay, I work in the European Commission. I'm not going to leave. I want to stay there and I want to work on this agenda, and I have no idea how. That's great. I mean, there are people like that who've joined the Deep Adaptation Forum, the European Commission, and a couple of guys who've retired from the Commission and key volunteers. So yeah, it's a forum, it's a community, it's a movement with that starting point. And there are some principles about, we want to engage with curiosity, compassion, and respect. We know it's a tough issue. We don't want you right ever. It's meant to be explored. I think that's a good way to be at the moment. So I can't say what we'd achieve exactly and by when. I'm working better stuff. I mean, one of those things in the world is the infrastructure plans. Yeah, it's quite sad that the way that we respond in a dominant economic paradigm, political paradigm, is farcical. And yet we need to not just retreat into some kind of misanthropy and alienation. We've got to keep showing up and with compassion, curiosity, and respect, and a sense of generative dialogue. So yeah, I've avoided saying exactly what by when. You know, I'd love to see monetary reform. I'd love to see all sorts. I'd love to see emergency adaptation measures on agroecologically informed food security stuff across Europe, all sorts. But something else comes first, which is our ability to stay with this and not run away to stories of he's an asshole or he's hurting the children or whatever, all the nonsense that comes because people just can't stay with this topic, so they want to vilify those who they heard it from. If you get into this, you'll get backlash from some people, and it's an amazing thing that to not take it personally. Because I remember I got angry with people talking, I do now, 10 years ago. But just to say on the multilateralism thing, yeah, Deep Adaptation people, the ethos is very much internationalist, decolonization, anti-authoritarian, very much into universal values. Yeah, and trying to promote dignity and have dignity no matter what's coming. Okay, so it's time. Good, and the links will be shared on the Globe EU website. Good. All right, thanks for joining, and yeah, if anyone wants any input, like to talk to someone who works on this, then do ask Roland-Jan, and someone I know will get back to you, if not me, confidentially.